Welcome back. Another week, a new conversation. This week, Saeed floated the idea of cognitive bias, which we are all big fans of, and there's tons to talk about. So um, I will actually, I'm going to refrain from this. I'm kind of curious about what's on Saeed's mind. I know he's touched on the topic recently. Is there anything like, is there a big question that you're framing this on, or were there insights coming out of that previous conversation that kind of sparked the interest for you, Said?
So I think it's an interesting topic because it affects us all. We're all prone to it, right? Individually and collectively. It's not a topic that we're ever taught about. Like I was never taught. Maybe I took the wrong courses, but it wasn't something that really came up in conversation. It just you think about it, you learn about some of these, confirmation bias being the most common one, it seems. And then when I started digging down into it, I was just astounded by how broad the topic is, and then how many of these biases are things that impact us without even knowing. And you hear things like, you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a common one, but I never really thought about it in the context of, oh yeah, that is a cognitive bias. It was the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so there's this whole, I think someone should create a taxonomy of these, I really do. But there's this whole kind of gamut of them, and some of them have very interesting names, some of them have very boring names. The IKEA effect is one of them that I read about. Anyway, I think it impacts us, and the fact that it's something that impacts us is something that we should learn about so that we can reduce the impacts of it, both in ourselves and in the work we do. But also an interesting point came up in this conversation was, are there ways to exploit them for your benefit? And that was one I'd never thought about. So I thought that was interesting. And maybe that's something to dig into, cognitive biases for the win.
Right. I like that framing. That's pretty fun. Yeah, it's interesting to think of them as an enabling constraint rather than a limiting constraint, right? That's the first thing that I thought of when I heard you say exploit, because I think a lot of people who are outside the community might hear exploit and think you're going to be manipulating people. But I think inside the community, we think about exploiting things as like, what can we leverage? What is available to us to benefit the cause. But I think, personally, I've become increasingly fascinated with cognitive bias and everything sort of like neuroscience and psychology, because I got into this space thinking about like efficiency and effectiveness and workflow. And even with my knowledge of like, it's never the tools and it's always people in process, and it's always people, it's like you sort of eventually you're just like, forget about everything else. It's just, everything is just people. Then you quickly come to this point where it's like, okay, well, first we've got to solve for the people aspect, or at least keep that top of mind. It's always should be the first thing that we consider. And so went from like value stream mapping as like this tool, this almost technical tool to solve specific problems, to the main benefit being the act of mapping, right? The act of like, pull all the stuff that's stuck inside everyone's brain that's probably completely different across the spectrum of a team, get it out, and let's talk about it and maybe resolve some of these differences and assumptions.
There's some interesting pieces there when you start to talk about cognitive bias, because even when we do the value stream mapping, we have everybody in the room and they all look at this and it's absolutely wonderful. But the biases that we have, the underlying assumptions, our beliefs, even when we see these things in front of us, it's not always obvious to us that we're biased towards things in a certain way. Even when it's even when it's made explicit. And there is one of my favorite images for this is there's something called the Cognitive Bias Codex, which is like, we should put it in the show notes, I guess. And it's a SVG as well, where you can go in and look at this, all of the 180 or however many different biases that there are on it that allow you to drill into this. And they have done that categorization of it into the different types of cognitive biases which relate to different types of things. And it's, equally, when we're fascinated by this, having this understanding that people, ourselves included, have this, and we bring this with us, and it's a consequence of our experiences and everything that we've lived through. And we have these biases, but understanding that and understanding that people will react in a certain way, and it is not out of malice or any particular intent, other than, well, that's the part of their belief system, part of their cognitive bias, is part of how they've ended up thinking. So yeah, it's like the IKEA factors, which was mentioned earlier, is one of my favorites too, that we associate more value to something that we built ourselves, which is definitely something we see a lot in the kind of work that we do in Flow.
Yeah. Well, speaking then, what is your favorite cognitive bias, Steve?
My favorite, wow.
Well, Peter
I
mentioned, you know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, we have these like dozens and dozens of biases, and keeping them in your head, or even placing them in your head at any given time, or relating them to each other, or categorizing them, is something that you know, we've never done. It isn't part of our formal education, and I feel like I'm constantly stumbling on a new bias every week, and then having it kind of stick in my head is a big challenge. So that's a really good question to ask about a favorite, but I suppose hindsight bias is the one that just, you know, constantly rears its head more than anything else for me. Not that I have any insights about it or any strong feelings, but in terms of like the one that tends to rear its head most often is hindsight.
Meaning that what hindsight is like, I
Just
don't
sort
know
of
the definition of that bias. So.
just sort of like thinking that something that happened was bound to happen the entire time, or that we understand the causes of something that's happened after the fact, even though, you know, as things are happening, we have no idea what's going on. But once it's happened, we can look back and say, oh yeah, you know, of course that happened. And sort of, you know, systems thinking it almost does this like Schrodinger collapse of like all possible options and eventualities collapse into something happening, and then we can look back at it and say, oh yeah, of course, obviously that's how it went down. And as we navigate the seas of life and we sort of drift through all the possibilities, of course, any sense of certainty that we would have would be pretty speculative, but it's very easy to look back on things and say, yes, of course, you know, or, you know, I understand the root cause of that thing, or I understand why that happened. When in reality, you know, there was infinite possibilities and probabilities, and things could have gone all over the place, but they just happened to kind of fall into place.
I like that Schrodinger's reference.
It's probably inappropriate. I don't know.
Well,
I hesitate to sprinkle in quantum theory into conversations because I'm a tourist.
Well, I'll say this. So I always bring in those kind of references because my background was physics, and I see a lot of these things that are the models are similar. So just on the same note, like, I don't know if you've heard of the Hawthorne effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's interesting because I knew of it, but I thought Hawthorne was some guy. And turns out Hawthorne was not some guy. Hawthorne is a place where this effect was observed. And it's the tendency for people to behave differently when they know they're being observed versus when they're not being observed, or they don't know that they're being observed, right? And you know, the example I always use is my kids would tell me that their teacher was being evaluated, and they knew their teacher was being evaluated because all of a sudden the teacher dressed better and the classroom was nicely organized, and you know, the teacher handed out notes or something. But I call that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of people. Because the act of observing changes the state, which is what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle talks about. And that's absolutely true for people as well. So I'll throw my physics references in as well.
Is that a bias?
I think it's absolutely biased. The tendency to use knowledge you had previously. If that's a bias, well, then, you know.
Oh,
There's another one,
sure,
one called The Curse of Knowledge, which you've probably heard of. And it's basically the tendency to assume that other people know what you know when you talk about something. And I run into that a lot in product management, because product management is kind of a real nexus of information. And I've seen and observed this, that product managers will assume that sales or marketing or other groups have the same context. And so, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's why. Okay, great. You get it, right? See you later. As opposed to, you know, living in their world and going, hey, we don't know any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just unload that on us. So there's actually a great Dilbert that I think applies to it. And I actually copied it out because I gave a talk on this recently. And the one frame says, sometimes one person's inability to understand looks like another person's inability to explain.
Right. That's a great way to frame that.
Yeah.
And I think it really depends on this hesitancy that we often have to just relay our understanding of things that we hear, right? It's so hard to build this habit. And I'm sure, you know, Peter, you've got a lot of experience in this through coaching, but it's like, it's been a hard one capability for me that I'm still, you know, constantly working on, is just this ability to say, here's what I heard you say, and just reconcile that gap between what someone intended to portray or communicate and what was actually heard. Is a game changer.
It's very true, and it's one of the things is that we're in, especially in this environment where we've got so many other distractions and so many other things that can grab our attention at any moment, that even being able to pay enough attention to actually fully understand what the other person is trying to communicate can be a challenge. And this is taking it back to value stream mapping again, perhaps, but this is the advantage of visualizing what it is you're talking about as well. That's why so often, if you're having a conversation and you want to create clarity between the two parties, creating a visual so you can both say, well, this is what I visualize, how I see what it is that you're saying. But not everybody's visual, but it's if people are, then they can really, really help to say, okay, this is how I picture it based on what you're saying. And they can either say, yes, no, that's not even close. And you can then start to collaborate more closely from there.
Yeah. I'm going to throw in another physics reference, but I that point that you made, like what was said versus what was heard, right? What happened versus what was observed. I use frames of reference, right? Different people have different frames of reference, so they'll interpret things differently. And then the physics example is the Doppler effect, right? Like the ambulance driver hears their siren, it's a pretty constant siren, and the person on the street, when they drive by, hears something completely different. And you can't tell the person on the street that, no, you did not hear that. And you can't tell the person in the ambulance, wait, the frequency changed. And because both of them are observing from their frame of reference, and that absolutely applies inside of business as well, right? Like from a product perspective versus a sales perspective, the world is completely different. Like they're just looking at the world differently. They look at customers differently. They look at, whatever they need completely differently. And it's really hard to reconcile that if you've not lived on the other side, or at least don't have empathy to understand what that person is experiencing. So I think it's a really critical problem, and I think you really need to be conscious about it to sort of address the problem, really, which is the way I look at it.
Yeah, I really like that analogy. I think that's a great way of putting it. We are slightly running out of time here, and we're about to head into the next piece. So we probably should wrap up the recording for today. And since you started us off today, Steve, do you want to take us out?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks for your perspectives, Peter and Said. Really enjoyed this one, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.